We have been going through the basics, going back to the Fifth Way, which is my first book that really kind of set the tone and laid out the principles by which the effect has been adhering to in the last 18 years. And so it's good sometimes to just go back to the beginning and take a look at the founding of things, and also get back to just the bare bones, look at Jesus. The subtitle of the Fifth Way is A Western Journey to the Hebrew Heart of Jesus. And it really is, it's about what does a modern Westerner need to do, prepare for, relinquish, in order to be able to sit at the feet of an ancient Eastern Jesus and actually understand what it was he was trying to convey, and what his first followers would have and hopefully did understand by the language that he used. And so in the very first section is a chapter called the Gospel of Luke. And in that Gospel according to Luke, the chapter there is designed to confront the stereotypes that we have about Jesus. And most importantly in that chapter is that we tend to think of Jesus as a pious character. That King James English is kind of, just beaten down into us. And so that he's standing there looking heavenward and arms out. And I think nothing could be further from the truth. I think that he was the first guy in the pool. I think that he was the guy who was just egging everyone on and laughing and just trying to bring people into the celebration of life. If you really read what it is he's saying, everything is about abundance. Everything is about celebration. There's no fasting because the bridegroom is here. There's a whole different way of looking at life, but we don't see it because we're removed from that culture. But to get back into that understanding that it is all about not just love, but by the playfulness that makes love real to us. How do we know we're really loved by someone? It's when they really, truly enjoy our company, when they light up when they see us, when all the kidding around that goes on, which was Lou's hallmark, when we're kidding around with each other and we're laughing, Come to lunch with us after the service, and you'll know exactly what we're talking about, because it's just riotous. And that's exactly, I think, what Jesus was. Always looking over his shoulder, bringing people on. In the second section, which is the way, the truth, and the life are the main three sections of the book. In the way, we're confronting a lot of the Western assumptions, the preconceptions that we have about theology and about the way our relationship with God works, that we have overlaid on top of a Hebrew Jesus and his Aramaic message. And so we talked about, in the last few weeks, we went through this section, we talked about the difference in the main metaphor between warriors and gardeners, that we as a church have adopted the warrior metaphor, but Jesus never used it. He was always about the gardener, which is a whole different mindset. It's just a slow, patient showing up to the rhythms of life. It's an invisible kind of existence. It's not spectacular, and yet that patient, consistent presence, tending to the soil, tending to all the tiniest details, and the humility of realizing that everything that we do as gardeners doesn't bring the miracle about. All it does is create the environment within which the miracle can happen, because the plant actually sprouts while we're sleeping. That is a whole different way of living life, bringing back a spiritual common sense to the way we understand our doctrine and understand the scriptures. So important, because we've gotten to a point in Western Christianity where sometimes the scriptures don't even make common sense anymore, and certainly the doctrine based on them does not make any common sense. But Jesus always makes perfect common sense when you put him back into the context. And then to look at kingdom as a process, to look at salvation, quote unquote, as a process rather than an event. And not only just a process, but a process that's happening here and now. The Jews don't think about the next life. The Jews don't even have a doctrine about the next life. In Judaism to this day, you can believe whatever you want about the next life. You can believe in reincarnation if you want to. That's okay. You can believe in a resurrection of the dead, very similar to Christianity. You can believe that the wicked get annihilated and just wink out of existence. All those things are possible under the big tent of Judaism because they're not focused on the next life. They know it's speculative. They know that we can't know. What we can know is this life, right here, right now. To a Jew, salvation is spiritual liberation here and now. Not entrance into heaven sometime beyond. And so this idea of kingdom as a process, kingdom is here now. These are assumptions that we lay on the teaching that we see in the New Testament. And until we strip those away, we're going to have a completely different idea of what Jesus is trying to tell us. The next section that we're going to be talking about is going to be looking at the shape of the journey. What is the actual shape of the journey? What's the shape of Jesus' way to kingdom and to Father? Because kingdom is the experience of the Father's presence right here and right now. What is the way that we can get there? Now, we here in the West, and we here in these modern times, we imagine all sorts of different shapes to our journey and how we're supposed to do this. We also imagine these ways as ways to an outcome that we are seeking. And for us, of course, it would be heaven and the avoidance of hell. But that's part of the problem, once again, because we're looking at this outcome as an event rather than the process that it is, a constant becoming. We're looking at salvation as happening sometime in the future rather than a continual becoming here and now. We tend to think of this as an intellectual shape of the journey, that we need to think our way to the Father. Or maybe we think of it as a legal journey, a legal shape, where we obey our way to the Father. Or maybe it's emotional, and we're going to feel our way. Or liturgical, religious, and so we're going to perform our way. Now, all of those, whether it's intellectual, legal, whether it's emotional or liturgical, they're all going to play a part. They're all part of the common experience of us moving through Jesus' way. They're legs of the journey, but they're not the journey itself. And it's so important for us to understand that. The journey is not a concept that we can think, and it's certainly not an outcome that we can grasp or acquire. As we talked about last week, the truth and the life is a person. And the way to both is a person as well. And so this way of Jesus is getting to know a person, getting into relationship with a person, falling in love with a person. This is so different. The way, the truth, and the life is a person, and that changes everything if we really let it sink in. If we really get out of our heads and stop looking at this as some sort of theological concept that needs to be agreed to before we can have God's acceptance, and realize we're falling in love with a person right here and right now. It changes everything. You know, as I was right at this point in the notes, I got a text from someone. And the text asks, when are we going to have another Q&A? Because I got a question for you. And the question was, let me read this so that I get it right. Why does God start us here on earth as opposed to sending us directly to heaven? You better wake up, John. Why does God start us out here on earth rather than taking us directly to heaven? But think about the assumptions of this. First of all, we're looking at heaven as an outcome to our life, right? And we're also looking at heaven as a place, up there someplace, out there someplace that we're going to go to. Think about our universe for a second. Most of us know that the universe is expanding, right? We've heard that before. The question is, what is it expanding into? And we often think about there's just a whole lot of space out there. And here's the ball of our universe from the Big Bang on is expanding into that space. But that's not it at all. What's happening is there is nothing out there at all. The universe is creating space as it expands. The whole fabric of space only exists within the space of the universe. And so when we think that we're moving into heaven, we're moving into God's unity, we're moving into this space that God takes up, we're also looking at it in the wrong way. Heaven is being created within us as we become along this way. As as we move along this journey, we are expanding and creating, or better, revealing heaven that is already within us. We don't move into it. It's within as an expand. It's exactly what Jesus said at Luke 17. You're not going to find kingdom out there someplace. It's not out there that you can move into. It's within. It's among. It's in the midst of. It's right here. Kingdom is always moving from inside to outside. And it expands into whatever expanse it's going to be as we continue to become. It's a whole different way of looking at this. And it's important for us to try to get the basics. So when we read the red letters of the New Testament, we can start to get into the ballpark. We can start to get into the mindset that Jesus is creating for us. Because he worked really hard to refocus us, refocus our view of the shape of this journey. Love is reframed by Jesus as not emotion or affection for the people that you already know, for your neighbor, for your family, for your tribe. That's easy. He's refocusing and reframing it as identification, even with the enemy. We can identify with another person. We can see them as a fellow human. We can see them as an extension of ourselves, even if we're someone we have no emotion, no feeling about. We can find the unity between us regardless of any feeling that we have, positive or negative. He reframes love for us. All of his confrontations with the Pharisees is trying to reframe our idea of law, our idea of liturgy, or our idea of ritual, religion, our idea of obedience as being this reward and punishment syndrome that we're so often looking at life, because life is made of reward and punishment, but not in a relationship with God. With God, it's completely different. With God, we've got this degreeless love, this indiscriminate love that we call grace. And Jesus says at Matthew 5:20, unless you surpass the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. Because unless we get past this idea of reward and punishment, unless we get past this idea of law being the arbiter and how well you perform under the law, how well you perform under ritual practice as being the arbiter of your righteousness, we're never going to be able to just be this presence, be the kingdom. He reframes our intellectual understanding from just understanding some data to actually having the conviction and the trust that is born of experience. We're not just reading this out of a book, not even the Bible. We cannot get there until we live it out, until we experience exactly what the process of knowing another person is all about. Knowing this person who is way, truth, and love. Knowing this person who is the ground of all being. Reframing all the various shapes of the journey that we have settled upon. Think of Jesus' Zen approach to teaching, right? Never answers a straight question with a straight answer. Ask him a question, he tells you a story. Ask him a question, he confronts the question. Why are you asking? Why do you call me good? There's only one who is good. There's always something to break the line of thinking right there, because our line of thinking is the problem. And so Jesus is trying to break that intellectual approach. Break up the mental assumptions, break up the preconceptions, and most importantly, allowing us the opportunity to let go of clarity as a control point. That's what we're trying to do when we're trying to get so clear and understand everything. We want to be able to control it. We use our understanding as control. If we can just understand this, right? Get our arms around it. But there's no getting your arms around God. And until we just learn to love the mystery, we're missing the whole point as well. We understand this intellectual shape of the journey, this intellectual approach, as theology. And we understand theology as that essential litmus test toward God's approval. We have to understand the theology correctly. We have to understand Jesus theologically correctly for him to be the right, quote-unquote, Jesus who has the power to save us. But what does Jesus say? He says, unless you become like a child, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. And the word he uses for child there is talia. And the interesting thing about talia, it means child, but it also means a bondservant or a slave at the same time. There is that Aramaic with all those multiple meanings, vertically layered up. But it's beautiful to understand that when he says talia, unless you become talia, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, think about the attributes of a child. We know those. But what does the child not possess? The child does not possess the ability to choose. The child is what the child is because nerve and synapse hasn't closed yet. But a bondservant or a slave chooses. Maybe the choice is only to serve or die, but the bond slave still chooses to serve, chooses to be in that humble position, chooses to just submit to what is being laid upon them. You put those two together, the wonder and the aliveness and the presence of the child with the volition, the actual choice of the bondservant, and now you've got the fullness of what Jesus is talking about. This isn't about intellectual understanding. This is about simple trust and submitting to something that you don't understand, something that you don't have the clarity about. You can't enter kingdom, Jesus says, until we move into this whole different place. So do you start to see what's happening here in terms of the way Jesus' teaching works? We have to move beyond theology. We have to move beyond intellect if we're ever going to get to first base with what Jesus is talking about. Little blip from the fifth way. God gave Adam the authority to name all the animals in the garden. And we've been naming everything since. And since in ancient Hebrew thinking, the authority to name something like a child or an animal was a symbol of the dominion held over that something, there's a psychological lesson here for us all. To this day, Jews won't speak the name of God as a sign of respect and to avoid showing any possible dominion over the mighty one. But the rest of us continue to name everything in sight, especially in the area of theology. Deep breath. You ready? There's dispensationalism and covenant theology. There's systematic theology and biblical theology. There's soteriology and eschatology, theism and deism, and even finite godism. Pantheism, panentheism, polytheism, henotheism, atheism, Gnosticism, and agnosticism. How about hermeneutics? Hypostatic union, Arianism, semi-Arianism, modalism, docetism, Nestorianism, and Pelagianism. You can be premillennialist, postmillennialist, or amillennialist, a pre, post, or mid-tribulation rapturist, a futurist, a preterist, a historist, or an idealist. You can practice Calvinism, Arminianism, Wesleyanism, Lutheranism, or Catholicism. You could be Eastern Orthodox, evangelical, pietist, Quaker, Shaker, LDS, JW, Foursquare, denominational, non-denominational, congregational, or just plain Baptist, or Anabaptist. You could look all these up and see what they mean, but that's not really the point. We have spent so much time and energy trying to describe, categorize, subdivide, and explain every aspect of God and his nature, to exert control and dominion over God and our relationship with him, if only by simply attempting to comprehend him. And that we don't even know what each other is talking about anymore, let alone actually agreeing on anything. And with all those theological terms flying, we have forgotten that while God gave us permission to name the animals of the garden, he didn't give us permission to name him. How could he? How could we? God told Moses from the burning bush that his name was Hayah Asher Hayah. That is, I am that I am. How can we really get any closer than that? How do we describe raw ultimate existence, that which simply is, any more clearly? How do we, using the finite tools such as language and the laws of physics, describe what is by definition infinite? Our limited language and concepts and equations melt all over the dashboard long before temperatures and velocities ever reach the neighborhood of infinity. It's turtles all the way down. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about that. Ancient cosmological model was that the earth was flat and resting on the back of an enormous turtle. And so the obvious question is, what's the turtle standing on? And the answer is, it's turtles all the way down. But of course it can't be, can it? And that's the problem. What is the final turtle standing on? And yet it's turtles all the way down. You know, there's something in us, and of course it's fear, that wants and needs a turtle to stand on. And so we keep trying to find that turtle. We keep trying to find that solidity, that clarity, that certainty. But God resists being named. God is not going to be named. God can't be named. We can't name him and know him at the same time. Because the moment we think we understand God, we stop experiencing God as a person unfolding every moment of our lives. And yet, we always try to prove God's existence logically, right? Thomas Aquinas was probably the best at this, you know. He was an Italian, a paisano, right? Yeah, there you go, Italian. 13th century. He was a priest, a Dominican. He was the greatest philosopher and theologian of the medieval church, and Catholic theology is based on what they call Thomism, Thomas Aquinas' theology. Amazing mind, amazing way of looking at life. He came up with 5 ways, his famous 5 ways, of proving that God actually existed. And the 5 ways were this. First of all was the unmoved mover. So if you look at life, everything's always moving, right? Everything, always moving. But things only move if there's an impetus to move. Think of one of those elaborate domino setups. You know, they set up the dominoes in all these patterns, and you push the first domino, and the thing just goes and goes and goes and goes through all these things. It's like that. Life is constantly moving. But who pushed the first domino? His idea is that everything here moves because it has been pushed. But there had to be something that was the unmoved mover, the one that moved itself, and that is what he called God. A related concept, the second one, was what he called first cause, that everything here had a cause to bring it into existence. But if you roll that clock back, there had to be a first cause, something that had no cause to it but self-existed. He had the concept of contingency, which was the third one. Everything that exists in our universe is contingent. That means it is in existence now, but it doesn't have to be in existence. And sometime later on, it won't be existent again. And so if everything is contingent, not really necessary, and could and will go out of existence again, if you think about it, at some point in a system like that, everything would go out of existence and there would be nothing. How can anything come from nothing? There has to be something that's not contingent, something that is independently existent. And that is what he called God. He had the concept of gradation or degree, that everything exists in a degree of perfection from very low to very high. But there had to be something that was absolutely perfect in order for this universe to exist as it does. And the fifth one was by design, the teleological argument, that everything that exists, even if it's unintelligent, is working towards some sort of purpose or some sort of end. If there is some purpose, if there is an end that everything is working toward, then there had to be a designer. These things don't just come from nothing. So these are his 5 ways. They're brilliant when you think about it, the way that they describe the universe around us and the way that they point to something that stands outside the physical universe and caused it, put it into motion. But all of these are contested, of course, and none of them are fully convincing. Not for the people who are debating with someone like Thomas Aquinas. And so given this, and given this inability of us to really prove God, why is faith prized so much in Scripture? Because there's no other way to approach the infinite. There's no other way to approach this God who stands outside of space and time. No other way to approach whatever is transcendent in our lives except through faith. Hebrews 11:6 tells us that without faith, it's impossible to please God. And so reading into pleasing God, it's not just like doing the right thing so that he's smiling at us. It's really about being one with God, beyond any concept of God, being one with God without any even cognition. There's nothing more pleasing to God than to be one with God. Without faith, that's impossible to do because you can't reason your way to God. I always talk about going half the distance and half the distance and half the distance. You never arrive if you do that. That's the task that we're setting ourselves when we try to reason our way to God. Eventually, you have to take the leap of faith. And if something were provable, if God were provable, then faith would not be needed. There would be no need for faith. There wouldn't be even any possibility of faith if something like God were provable. Certainty is the opposite of faith, not doubt. Certainty is the opposite of faith. As soon as we think we're certain, we have left the realm of faith. Faith is ability to act in the presence of doubt, in the presence of uncertainty. To take that leap into the void when we don't know what's coming, but we're trusting enough to see if we're going to be caught. And so with all of this, we got to be honest with ourselves. We can't prove God to another person. There's no way to do that. How can we prove God logically when God stands outside of logic? How do we prove God empirically when he stands outside of physics? We can prove God to ourselves, but not to another person. And when we prove God to ourselves because of our experience, I like to call that conviction. We can become convinced. We're still not certain. Are we absolutely certain? Well, there's no way to be certain, but our conviction can run so deep that it really doesn't make any difference. God occupies a space beyond theology, beyond naming. Because as soon as God is named, then God is not God anymore. John Chrysostom, a saint and one of the early church fathers, is credited with saying that a comprehended God is no God. If we could completely comprehend God, get our arms around God, he would cease to be God for us now, wouldn't he? Right? And yet this seems to be our task. We want to prove God. We want that turtle to stand on. But what we got to do is stop naming God. Let it go. Occupy his space and experience God. Stop trying to understand him. Because once God is experienced, theology simply becomes our best expression of the inexpressible. And that's really what theology is. It's our best expression of the inexpressible. But it's still inexpressible. That doesn't mean that theology has no place or no purpose. Of course it does. It can help direct us. It can help guide us. I love the way the Eastern Orthodox Church looks at theology. It sets the limits of error. It sets the guardrails for us. Beyond this point, we get into some kind of abuse. Beyond this point, we're going in a negative direction. But within this plain space, go for it. Play. Experiment. Go too far and come back. They have a very different way of looking at theology. We need to take a listen to what they have to say. Now, at the same time, the scriptures are always talking about knowing God. Ezekiel, the book of Ezekiel, has that phrase, knowing God, over 70 times in just one book. Jesus talks about knowing too. Take a look at Matthew 7, starting at verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. So this knowing God, what is it to know God? Another blip from the fifth way. To know in Hebrew is expressed by the word yada. In Aramaic, the same word is yada. Both words come from the same ancient root, meaning hand. The actual pictogram looked like a Y to us, but it was a simplified hand. And since Semitic words were formed out of the meaning of their roots, understanding root meanings provides a cultural context for the word. The idea here is to know something is not to think it, but to handle it. To have such long-standing experience and familiarity that you can feel its shape in your hands. The hammer and saw in the hands of the journeyman carpenter have worn calluses around their shapes through years of constant use. The carpenter can feel the weight of the tool in his hands even when they are empty. Can feel the swing or stroke that addresses the wood, just as the musician can feel the instrument. The strings are keys under her fingers. A lover can feel the face of his beloved, and his hands ache to hold her familiar form when she is not present. Knowing God has nothing to do with mental concept and everything to do with constant use, with the easy familiarity of long relationship. Like the way well-worn jeans wrap around your hips, or the way couples long married begin to look like each other and finish each other's sentences. It's about intimacy that can only be found through the experience of being intimate. And if that isn't enough to get the concept across, to know was also a Hebrew euphemism for sexual intercourse, for making love. When Adam knew Eve, when a husband took his wife into his tent and knew her, there was ultimate intimacy between them, ultimate knowing. This is the kind of knowing Ezekiel is talking about. It's the kind of knowing Yeshua is talking about when he tells us that there will be those who say, Lord, Lord, and expect to enter the kingdom but will not, because they and God don't know each other. Not because their theology is wrong, but because they've never taken God into their tents and worn the shape of his form into the palms of their hands. Never experienced the sensation of having their very muscles remember the feel of God in their embrace. This kind of knowing has nothing to do with terms and concepts. It has nothing to do with theology at all. It is purely and simply intimate, ongoing relationship with God as reflected in our relationships with each other. The two are inseparably linked. Knowing theology is not knowing God. Living together, hanging our toothbrushes side by side, that's the kind of knowing Ezekiel would recognize. So when Jesus says, I never knew you, yada, no, what he's basically saying is we've never been intimate. We've never had those moments together. Now, God is always intimate with us. There is nothing that separates God from us, right? But it's up to us to close that circuit. We are the ones who need to do the work that it takes, lifelong work, to let go of everything that separates us from God, from each other. The lack of intimacy, the lack of intimate relationships is because of all the stuff that has been built up in us that is defensive, that keeps everything at arm's length. But at the same time, God is not throwing these lawless, quote-unquote, people out, the ones that he doesn't know. That's an idiomatic saying. In Hebrew, often the consequence or the outcome is shown as the cause. I know that sounds a little weird, right? But think about, many are called, but few are chosen. It sounds like God is the actor in all of that, because that's the way they understood God. Nothing happened without God's approval. But the truth of the matter is, everyone is called. Everyone is intimate from God's point of view. But few choose to be chosen. Few hear and answer the call. Consequence or outcome shown as cause. Same thing is happening here. Think about the word that is translated as lawless here. Allah in Aramaic. When I first looked that up in a lexicon several decades ago, I was shocked because the first definition of the word was a suckling infant. And the second definition was a colt, a young horse. And the third definition was a lawless one, or lawlessness. What in the world is going on here? I thought I looked up the wrong word. Now remember that these Semitic languages are only written with consonants. Okay, there's no vowel points in the words. And so the same word, those same consonants can mean suckling infant, colt, or lawlessness, all at the same time. It's only the vowel points that change. But once again, those root words, the meanings of the letters themselves are giving us a sense of how the Semitic mind, how the Hebrew mind looks at a concept like lawlessness. Remember when we talked about Taba and Bisha, good and evil, really meaning ripe and unripe, mature and immature? It's the same thing here. What ties those three things together? A suckling infant, a colt, and a lawless person. Immaturity, unripeness, the inability to have an intimate relationship. God doesn't throw them out. They have not yet worked through the ability to know God, to have any kind of intimacy with God. And to understand that this intimacy and entering kingdom is not heaven of the afterlife. It's here and now. The intimacy of here now kingdom is the intimacy of being present to God's presence and having that completely change everything about your experience of life. And that day that he talks about, that most of us think as the final day of judgment, that's any day. That's every day that we approach a moment, that we approach God. Have we become a people that are ripe enough to have an intimate moment with God and everything that shares the moment with us? Knowing is not understanding. Knowing is not clarity or certainty. Knowing is about intimacy and trust, way beyond theology. There's another parable that helps illustrate this, and it's one that it's not going to look like it makes sense immediately as you read it. But take a look at Matthew 20, starting right at verse 1. Now here's another parable where Jesus is going to say, the kingdom of heaven is like. So this is another extended simile, right? He's trying to show us, what is this kingdom? How can we understand this kingdom? How can we understand this intimacy with God right now and in every aspect of our lives? The kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. And when he had agreed with the laborers for a denarius for the day, he sent them into his vineyard. And he went out about the third hour and saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And to those he said, you also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right I will give you. And so they went. Again, he went out about the 6th and 9th hour and did the same thing. And about the 11th hour, he went out and found others standing around. And he said to them, why have you been standing here idle all day long? And they said to him, because no one has hired us. He said to them, you go into the vineyard too. Now, before we go on, we need to know something about Hebrew timekeeping in the first century to understand what these hours actually mean. The Hebrews divided the day into 12 hours from sunrise to sunset. So from 6 in the morning to 6 p.m., the 12 hours. And they were always varying in length based upon the time of year, right? They're going to be longer in the summer and they're going to be shorter. They didn't care about that. That doesn't matter. It's just the hour, right? And the night was divided into 3 watches of 4 hours. So from 6 p.m. until 10 was the first watch. From 10 to 2 a.m. was the second watch. From 2 a.m. to 6 in the morning, sunrise, that was the third watch. But during the day, you just counted the hours. And so from 6 to 7, at 7 o'clock, that was the first hour. And then 8 o'clock was the second hour, and 9 was the third hour, and so on all the way. So look what's happening here. He goes out early in the morning. So he's going out right at sunrise. And he hires his first batch of workers, and they go out into the fields. And then he goes back at the third hour, which is 9 a.m., and he finds more, and he sends them out. And then he goes out, the 6th and the 9th hour, so that's noon and 3 p.m., and he finds more workers. And then he goes out at the 11th hour. The 11th hour is 5 p.m. There's only 1 hour left in the workday. Those first laborers have been working for 11 hours, and he hires the last batch of workers at the 11th hour, and they work 1 hour. Okay? Setting the table for you. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last group to the first." And when those hired at the 11th hour came, each one received a denarius. And when those hired first came, they thought that they would receive more. But each of them also received a denarius. And when they received it, they grumbled at the landowner, saying, "These last men have worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden and the scorching heat of the day." But he answered and said to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what is yours and go. But I wish to give to this last man the same as you. Is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with what is my own? Or is your eye envious because I am generous? So the last shall be first, and the first last." Now, how does that sit with you? How would you feel if you started working at 6 a.m.? See, this parable makes no moral sense. It makes no ethical sense. It certainly doesn't make any business sense, right? It doesn't make any intellectual sense, theological sense. It doesn't make any sense from that point of view. It seems patently unfair, just as the reception of the prodigal was unfair to the elder brother who worked for his father all those years while the younger one went off and squandered what wasn't even his to squander. It's outrageous. It's unfair. And the theme is the same between these two parables. Now, there are a lot of different interpretations for all of this. The payment, the denarius, is usually viewed as heaven, and this is heaven of the afterlife by Christian commentators. But as we said before, that's really an un-Hebrew thing to think, because they're not going to be focused on afterlife. They're going to be focused here and now. And coming to the vineyard is normally understood as conversion to the faith, either early or late in life. Or those 11th hour guys, that's the deathbed conversion, right? That we get so upset about. The Jeffrey Dahmers, who after they do all this horrible stuff and they have a jailhouse conversion, what, they get to go to heaven too with me? Are you kidding me? After all I did all these years? You see where he's leading with this. Now others look at this confrontation or sorts between the Jews and the church, that the Jews came first because Jesus was speaking and teaching directly to the Jews, and the Gentiles came later, yet all are saved. And so the Gentiles are just as grafted in as the Jews. Others think it looks at some sort of social justice, right? Equality for everyone. Even an argument for minimum wage, I've heard, is what Jesus is trying to do here, they say. But the real context for this is in the previous chapter, chapter 19. Chapter 19 tells us about the rich young ruler who comes to Jesus. What must I do to enter the kingdom of God, right? And Jesus says, well, keep the commandments. He says, well, I've kept these from my youth. Okay, great. Then go sell everything that you have, give it to the poor, and come follow me. And of course, he's not ready to do that. He was looking for another control point. He was looking for another rule to obey that was safe, that he could do under his own terms and control. And Jesus is saying, you got to lose that control, brother. Sell everything. Let it all go and come and follow me. But he's not ready. And then Jesus makes the comment how hard it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. That it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter God. And everybody, of course, is blown away. Because in their culture, it was the rich who were shown the advantage by God, not those who were poor. And so they say, well, then who can be saved if the rich can't be saved? And then Peter blurts out, it's always Peter. You got to admire the guy. Hey, we dropped everything and followed you all this time. What then is there for us? What do you think Peter's looking for? He's looking for some special status. He's looking for something more than a denarius, right? Because he was first in. There must be something more for me as first in. And so this whole parable then is really a direct answer to Peter's question. And the parable is not about the laborers at all, is it? No. It's about the owner. It's about God. It's about the nature of God's love that we call grace, this degreeless and indiscriminate love. And it's not at all about our performance or how long we performed. None of that has anything to do with it. What does the father say to the elder brother of the prodigal? All I have is yours. Everything I have is yours. This denarius that is offered to the laborers, it's a day's wage that represents everything that they could possibly need for that day. The daily bread in the Lord's Prayer, right? Better translated directly from the Aramaic as the bread of our need this day. What is it talking about? It's talking about kingdom, this idea of heaven today. It is the enoughness of this moment, right here and right now, this day. The workers who came early in the morning, they can't be paid more than everything that God has, because everything that God has is what is being poured out here. And the workers who came late can't be paid any less, because God is everything. God is always everything and can't be anything other than everything. What part of everything don't we understand? And yet, until we experience the everythingness of God, until we experience that love that showers upon us, whether we're in our best graces or our worst, then we won't have any clue to this nature that Jesus is trying to get across to us. And there's one last detail. Those first workers who came early in the morning, whether we consider them Jews coming first, or the disciples of Jesus, his closest friends and followers, coming in first. In other words, those who are under the covenant of Moses and Abraham. They understood that they had a deal with the owner. They're the only ones who made the deal to work for a denarius. And so they had an expectation because they had the deal. They had the promise. Or maybe the first in are those who are schooled in theology, who think that they really understand what's going on in law, in doctrine, and they see themselves as having a deal with God because they understand this. And so they also have an expectation. And yet those who came later and those who came last, they have no deal. They agreed to work for whatever they were paid. No deal, no expectation either. They just trusted the owner to be fair. This represents the child. This represents Talia. The first workers felt entitled and they were resentful when they didn't get what they thought they should get. The last workers were simply grateful for whatever pay that they got, which was everything. But the first workers got everything too. But the perspective was shifted. And so they were angry. They were resentful about the same everything that the Talia got and were grateful. The first shall be last and the last first. The last are those who trust. And they are paid first because they are the first to respond. Always the first to respond are those who don't feel entitled, those who don't feel that they're in the know, those who stand at the margins of life are the first to respond, the first to experience, and the first to know the true nature of their God. Jesus is calling us to this kind of life. He's calling us beyond theology, beyond our intellect, beyond law, beyond ritual, beyond all the things that we can measure our performance against, to the true shape of our journey. From intellectual understanding and entitlement to simple, grateful dependence and trust. Until we make this shift, we will never understand the extent of what Jesus is trying to get across to us. Let's pray. Father, the first thing we want to do is simply thank you for your love. Thank you for your everything, that you withhold nothing ever. that everything you are and everything that you have is already ours. It's already here. It's already now. It's already within us. Help us stop to trying to earn what is already ours. Stop trying to acquire what we already possess. Help us to see that you are this different kind of God that is not reward and punishment. There's no performance that can get us any closer to you than we already are. And so help us to let go and work through the things that are keeping us from you and seeing you as Jesus is trying to show us. Thank you, Lord, for everything, always. Help us to get there, step by step, bit by bit, whatever it takes, to shed our skins and become more and more able to simply play in the garden that you have given us. Thank you, Father. Never let us forget we can only love because you loved us first. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's all stand.